Huh?
That's what I just told him. I got a bad case of lungs.
Oh, I don't know
Well,
what
it was some good.
is the weather change or what?
Well, I can blame bad weather or traffic or whatever I like, but the case is that we are late getting started, so I'll go ahead and get into class. We're going to be picking up from chapter 4 where we left off on Sunday. We read through the chapter at that time, and we'll be reflecting on our own personal response to that at this point. The title of chapter 4 of Lord, Sometimes I Don't Feel Saved, was Love Him, I Don't Even Like Him. And that's a pretty poignant title. And brings to mind exactly the kind of feelings we can have from time to time towards our fellow Christians, let alone people in general. So as we're looking at the questions, the first question just follows on that in particular. Question 1 in our personal inventory is it possible to like all Christians? My answer to that, pretty straightforward there, was no. I don't think it is possible to like all Christians. I think that the word like is obviously a very flexible word, which can have a lot of different meanings. But in this particular case, there's just the idea of differences in personality. There are some people who you are just not going to particularly enjoy their company, let's say, no matter how much you may have regard for them or respect for them as believers. The question here, is it possible to like all Christians? That's in our inventory here. I think can easily be answered no, because there's at least going to be, even if you like most people, there's probably going to be at least one guy where you're like, you know what, I just don't really like him. I might care for him as a brother, I might regard him as an equal, I might have every respect for him in the world, but there's just not a lot of affection between us, is the word. So, but that's the point of what we're studying here. Is it possible to like all Christians? No, but we are commanded to love them. So regardless of what our personal feelings may be towards one individual or another, whether we would like to keep them in our company, whether they be friends with us, is an entirely separate question for how we treat them in regard to our conduct. And it's the same sort of idea that we've been talking about with the rest of this. When we have been talking about love in these past few chapters, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves about the words that we're using. For this chapter in particular, the word love, agape, in prior eras of the Greek language, before the Bible was written, the word agape didn't actually have the connotation of love necessarily. As a verb, it meant something that you go after, something you pursue. But it later on, and closer to the time that the Bible was being written, took on the meaning of to prefer or to set as a priority, to put one thing above another. So agape, in being translated into love, loses something of that idea of priority. We are to prioritize people above ourselves. We're to regard other people's interests as more important than our own, but that does not require any particular feeling on our part in terms of our enjoyment of someone's company, our affection towards that person, or anything like that. Going on to page 45 of the book, it says, you cannot command another person to like his or her enemies, yet Jesus commands us to love our enemies. In fact, if I'm being perfectly honest, I must admit there are some folks, even among my brothers and sisters, with whom I have some major differences. We may have personality conflicts, we may be at odds. That is not to be preferred, but it is all right as long as I love them. The command to love, to prioritize above oneself, someone else above oneself, is paramount, regardless of personal liking. And this is one of the problems when it comes to translating the Bible and applying it to our lives in general. The language we use does not directly and perfectly mirror the language of the Scriptures, and sometimes it requires a couple extra steps of explanation. That's part of what we're doing with our study today. Looking at question number 2, it says, what difficulties arise when you try to love someone you don't like, for example, an enemy? And I think this helps to clarify that first question a little bit more. Because I can see how question number 1, is it possible to like all Christians? There may be a tendency for us to, it's a yes or no question, isn't it? The way that's posed, you really have to give an up or down answer the way that's posed. And there may be a tendency to pick one of those 2 points and really stick with it and say, no, you've got to like your fellow Christians. We've got to get along. God commands us to unity and to working together for good works. And on the other side, no, absolutely, there's no call to like everybody. As long as we're getting along to get everything done, once you leave the company of other Christians for the work of the Lord, it's not necessary to include them in your social circle or to have any particular affection for one person or another, as long as you're getting the work done. I think there's actually scriptural call for both, or example rather. In the book of Acts in particular, I'm thinking of Paul. Paul has a very strong personality. You see that throughout his writings, you see that throughout his interactions with other people. Paul and Barnabas set out to go on a mission trip, and Barnabas was to bring along this guy named John Mark. And Paul doesn't like John Mark, because he brought John Mark on the last mission trip, and John Mark left partway through. And Paul says, this guy doesn't have any regard for the work we're trying to do. He's willing to bail out on us in the middle of the task we're trying to accomplish. Why should I take along a guy like that? And it's enough of a fight where Barnabas takes John Mark's side, and Paul takes his own side, and they part ways. Now later on, Paul and Barnabas make up. I'm not really sure if John Mark's involved in the reconciliation. But the whole point was, they kept doing the same work in 2 different places. They didn't suddenly split the church. They were still fellow ministers of the gospel, even though they weren't able to work in each other's presence anymore. There was maybe no longer any warm feelings between them, at least for a time, but they still stayed on the course of the work that needed to be done. So there was a sense of prioritizing, agape-ing, you might even say, the gospel over the particular desire to work together to go on this particular mission trip. And Paul had other ministers who were willing to go with him, other people who joined him, and they got the work done regardless. But going back to the question at hand here, what difficulties arise when you try to love someone you don't like, for example, an enemy? Now, if we are using the word love as it is commonly used, not in the way we've been describing it in this chapter, the problem arises that you go, exactly the title of this chapter. Love him, I don't even like him. You start thinking about your own particular feelings about a person, and that conflicts with the godly command to put them above yourself. For example, when we're talking about enemies, an enemy fundamentally is someone who is opposed to you, someone who has a differing position from you, and in most common sense is that word. If it's not to destroy you completely, they at least want you to see you fail. They are your enemy. Your success is their failure. Your wins are their losses. And this isn't like in sports where, oh yeah, you win this season, but we'll get you back next time. We're talking about warfare, kind of in the sense of an enemy. These aren't rivals. These are people who want to tear you down. So when God says your enemy, the person who is opposed to you, you're supposed to love that person. How can you love someone? How can you like them? How can you care for them, feel affection for them, if they actively hate you and want to see you dead? That call is is absurd on any definition of the word until you start putting our definitions we've got here. It would be hard to swallow even from Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace, for him to tell you you've got to feel affection for and warm feelings and kindness and all of these good things. You don't want to go up and hug the guy who's pointing the knife at your throat. That's not what Jesus is asking you to do. What he is saying is, when we're talking about that word agape, he wants you to put your enemy first, even over your own enemies. He wants you to prioritize the people who don't care for you and people who want to destroy you. Looking at question number 3, we're going to expand on that a little bit further. The author in that question says, look at the use of the word agape or agapao in 2 Peter 2:15 and 1 John 2:15. How do these passages increase your understanding of the meaning of the word? Is agape always used in a positive way? Now, we're going to stay in 1 John because that's where our text has been. We're just going to move a little bit further down the chapter from where we were today. So let's go to 1 John 2:15 first. I'm actually going to start with verse 15 itself and continue through verse 17 if you'd like to follow along. 1 John 2:15 starts out this way. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. And before we discuss that, I'd like to move on and read the passage from 1 Peter, and then we'll expand on both of them side by side, because they have similar uses of that word. So I misspoke. It's actually 2 Peter and chapter 2. So if you'd like to go to 2 Peter chapter 2, just one book back from where we are in 1 John, and in verse 15. I'm going to actually read a little bit more than that. I'm starting in verse 10. There's kind of like a half verse. So I'm starting with the word daring here, and halfway, it's 10b, because it starts in the middle of a sentence, a verse, but it's the beginning of a new thought. Daring, self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties, whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. Speaking of false teachers here. But these, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. Suffering wrong is the wages of doing wrong. They count it pleasure to roam in the daytime. They are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having heart trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed to the way of Balaam the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but he received a rebuke for his own transgression. From a mute donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, for a mute donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, restrained the madness of the prophet. So the word love there was in verse 15. It said, Balaam loved the wages of unrighteousness. So both in that passage that we looked at later in 1 John 2 and this one here in 2 Peter 2, we use the word agape, love. But Balaam agapes the wages of unrighteousness. And then we saw in 2:15 the command, do not prioritize, do not agape, do not love the world. So, by adding this clarity into our understanding of the language being used, we can clear up some things. I have often had people ask me this question, and when I was younger, had this question myself. If we're supposed to be going into all the world, like Jesus said to his apostles, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every living creature, and then he goes up into heaven, Well, if we're loving the world by spreading the gospel, right? We're going out and telling the world how much Jesus loves them. It's a different kind of an idea, right? Because Jesus is prioritizing sinful people above himself and dying on the cross for them. But if we as individual people prioritize the things of the world above godly things, then we fail to do what God wants. The context of the word love here matters, even though it may be the same vague concept. Yes, we are to prioritize even worldly people, even our enemies above ourselves, put them first so that God may save them through our example and through our preaching the gospel. But we are not to prioritize the things of this world, the way the world operates, above the way God does things. And in this passage in particular, it says that, because it goes from do not love the world to describing what loving the world looks like, and it's the world and its lusts, its desires, its cravings are such, and this world is passing away, and also those desires that go with it, the lusts that go with it, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. So this loving the world here is not loving the people who are in the world with us. It is loving this world and the corrupted things that are associated with it. That clarity of purpose is what's important here. And so again, our question is, how do these passages increase your understanding of the meaning of the word? Is agape always used in a positive way? And it's no. If we are prioritizing the wrong things, if we're like Balaam prioritizing earthly gain to the point where we'll sell out our service to God in order to get money, or if we're like John is describing here, and where people will prioritize the things that this world desires over the things which God provides for us, then yes, those are very not negative ways. Those are not positive ways that agape could be demonstrated. We could prioritize things that don't deserve that priority, that are unfit in God's sight. And the clarity of being able to use that word as what it means, as a concept of something being prioritized over something else, helps us when we understand the positive as well. Because if we just go into it thinking of God's unconditional, sacrificial love, it starts seeming too big for us, in my opinion. Because after all, we don't have Jesus to give up onto the cross. He's already done that for us, right? We don't have a big sacrifice that we have to make. But the small sacrifices that we are called to can sometimes seem like a burden if we're thinking of it in terms of that affectionate love. If instead we're thinking of it as this love of priority, even if it hurts me and my pride and my temporary comfort, I am to prioritize those who would do ill for us. So let's actually go to question 5 before we answer question 4, because that will expand on this some more. In question 5, the author refers to Matthew chapter 5. So let's look at that passage from the Gospel here. Matthew chapter 5 tells us that we are in the Sermon on the Mount, the longest and probably most famous sermon of Jesus's. And we're looking at a passage that starts in verse 38 here. Now, one of the things about Matthew chapter 5 and the Sermon on the Mount in general, and looking at the way Matthew has edited his gospel, there are a bunch of sort of episodic parts to this where it can be easy to kind of break one of these out and look at it as an individual thing and miss the greater context, because they are rather self-contained. But let's just remember for a moment what the theme, the thread that goes through all of them from the beginning to the end of the Sermon on the Mount is. It is heavenly perspective on earthly matters. Because he starts out with the Beatitudes, where he says, blessed are all of these horrible things. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are, poor in spirit. Those are painful things to be. And then other things that are things that are to be admired, but aren't necessarily very easy to embrace. Blessed are the pure in heart. Well, everybody wants to be savvy. Everybody wants to know how things go in the world, and they want a little bit of shrewdness. If you're too pure in heart, people take advantage of you. Blessed are the peacemakers. If you're always getting out of a fight, you may not get your way. If you're always trying to make a compromise, you may have to be taken advantage of sometimes. So these are not always positive things. But that thread going all the way through is to have a heavenly perspective on earthly things. And it's very true also in this passage we're looking at here. Matthew 5, starting in verse 38, says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek turns the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. To him who asks of you, do not turn away from him who wants to borrow. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." Jesus here does not actually use the word agape in this passage. We don't actually see the word love show up, but I believe we see it being practiced. If we look at how this is put, there are a certain set of things that people by rights could possibly demand from you, and Jesus says, go one step further and give them more than they're asking for. The first example says, if someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If someone offends you, humiliates you, puts you in your place by striking you, you tell them to go ahead and strike you again. You don't you get defensive. You don't say, how dare you, sir? All these other things. You let him hit you again. If someone wants to sue you, for some offense or some debt, and take your shirt from you to pay that back, he says, go ahead and give him your coat. Now, there's 2 different garments being described here. The chiton, which is the shirt, is like a tunic. It would be, maybe knee or ankle length, and it would have been made out of several pieces of cloth, and it would have, or at least one piece of cloth folded over and sewn at the sides, and it seems like this with places for your arms and maybe even sleeves, but not necessarily. Sometimes it was just long enough that when it was, put together, it would cover your arms as well as kind of poncho style, if you can imagine that. And then the second word here, which my Greek is failing me, my memory at least is failing me, but the word that is used, although I can't remember the actual Greek word right at this moment, is actually the word that, I'm not even going to pretend like I know and guess, because it's just right there, but I'm going to mess it up if I try and say it. But it's a word for an outer garment that is put on top of that. So you've got your shirt that you would wear, that you might even have a couple of, even if you were poor, because it was a cheap garment. You probably had a nice one that you wore to temple and another one you wore to work. And it was a garment where even ordinary people could have 2 of. But the outer cloak is expensive. Even if you had to save up forever to get one, your goal when you're getting a cloak is to get one that's a single piece of fabric woven together with no seams, because they wear out. They wear longer. There's no seams to wear out and come apart, because if you're hand woven, it's not like modern textiles where they'll last a little bit longer, assuming it's not some cheap maybe China stuff, I guess is what I'm saying. They didn't have the refinement that some modern clothing did. So this cloak was an expensive garment. And so if he's saying, well, take off give them your cheap shirt, but also give them that expensive cloak that you can't spare. Give them both. That's a big ask. Jesus is telling them, not only give up that thing that you can go get another one from the market, but that thing that you maybe saved up for or worked on for a long time to make yourself. Give him that also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a doubling of the requirement. But the whole point is not the number of miles you're walking either. It's that you're doing more for the person who is demanding something that may go against what you want to give, what you might desire to give to somebody, but Jesus is requiring as a spiritual command here. So the whole point of agape, once again, is a matter of priority. If our priority is on ourselves and our own satisfaction, on keeping the things of the world, as we talked about from that passage from John earlier, and satisfying our flesh, then we might miss out on these opportunities to do good for somebody. Just again, in those verses we were looking at, this is 1 John chapter 2, and starting in verse 16, he says, "All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." Now, I preached a sermon, and it may have been here, it may have been prior to working with you guys, where I actually took those 3 pieces and I put them back on the temptation of Jesus after his baptism. And I said, okay, there's these 3 ideas and they match up with each of the temptations that were put before Jesus. It was a very high concept sermon. I congratulated on myself on my cleverness at the time, but I'm not entirely sure that these are sort of like 3 absolute categories of types of temptations and desires that we can be pulled aside from, as much as it was John describing in this particular passage the 3 things that keep us from loving other people. And I think that's the real important part of this. Because his main emphasis in this whole book is going to be this love, this prioritizing of other people. And it's also going to be our salvation as it relates to that. Remember, he's talking about you have to love your brother to abide in the light. He says that in verse 10, chapter 2. So, if we're concerned with loving our brothers in order to abide in the light, then when we love the world instead, when we prioritize the world instead, we are no longer loving our brother right, because then we are pursuing things that are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. So let's define those just a little bit more, and then we'll get back to the questions from the author here. I think I have enough time to do that, and so I think it's a worthwhile pursuit here for us. The first one, when we're saying the lust of the flesh. So we understand what the body is, and sometimes we take that word lust and we automatically hear sexual desire. That is not unreasonable, and certainly within the category of the lusts of the flesh. But the word lust is so tied together with sexual desire in modern English that it makes it seem like that's the only thing that fits in this category. The Greek word simply is desire, and it's like our word agape was used positively and negatively. That word lust, that's translated lust here, can also be used positively and negative. There's other places where you could say very easily, I'm making up an example here because I can't think of a specific one from Scripture, but like, I desire to see you again. It's not I lust to see you again. It's I would like to be with you. It's my earnest, fervent desire. I miss you, is what he's trying to say. But it's that same word that gets translated differently based on context. And I think in this context, if we say lust, we might miss everything else. Greed is not necessarily a lust of the flesh. That could be more of the other 2 categories, but it could definitely be there. Gluttony certainly is. Desiring to satisfy the body with food. Laziness fits very well into this category, where you're desiring to give up on a duty you may have in order to satisfy your desire to be slothful and sit around. There are many categories of sin that will fit very comfortably in satisfying the flesh. The flesh desires these things, but if they're not placed if Jesus is not, and our brothers are not placed above them, then if our priorities aren't where they're supposed to be, then they become sinful. You got it? But gluttony is a sin. It is perfectly reasonable for a person who's married to desire their spouse, but adultery is a sin. There are categories which, broadly speaking, are not sinful, but that there are types of sins that exist within them. And so that's what we're talking about here. Going on to the lust of the eyes, there are certain things that jealousy, covetousness, these kinds of sins where we see something and we desire to have that same thing for ourselves, either to be seen having it, to put out a certain image, or just to own it. And finally, the grossful pride of life, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. We've been talking about humility and pride a lot in these chapters that we have been working through. One of the main problems, one of the main barriers to loving our brothers, especially in this chapter, has been pride. Somebody's my enemy. Why should I do anything good for him? And that is a huge barrier that all of us can face at different times. So, having said all of that, that sort of fulfilled what I wanted to talk about on this particular topic. And so finally, we'll conclude our class today by examining question 4, which I skipped a few moments ago. Is it possible for a person to be so blinded by his lifestyle, walking in the darkness, that he cannot see the way out? Remember in previous chapters that we were talking about lifestyle as a modern word to describe this walk with God, the continuing to walk in the light that John was so concerned with in some of our earlier passages. If a person is blinded by his lifestyle, walking in the darkness, is it possible that he cannot see the way out? And I think it's very clear that John wants us to say yes. That there are certain people who are walking in the darkness and they need God to provide that light to get them out. And not that it's impossible for people to find their way out, but it is possible for a person to remain lost. It's very possible. And the reason for that is that keyword lifestyle. If our patterns of life, the way we continue to conduct ourselves, continues to lead us further into darkness or further along the same degree of darkness, if we want to think about it as getting better or worse, there would be no reason for us to change unless light comes in and intervenes and changes our perspective on our surroundings. There have been a few times when I've either been in a hotel or some other family place and been asleep, and you get up to go get a drink of water or whatever other nighttime activities you need to take part in the middle of the night in a strange place. And until I saw some light, I was bumping my toe on things or knocking things over in the dark because the path that I assumed I was on was different from the one I intended to take. I needed light to clarify things. And that's the same thing here for us in our spiritual walk. We may fully intend to do the right thing, but without the light of God in our lives, we'll never actually end up on that path. Well, that concludes my comments for our class for today. Did anybody have anything to add? Any questions or discussion? Well, I welcome your comments at any time, and you all know how to get hold of me if there's stuff after the fact you think of. I would gladly discuss it with you and happily include it in my comments for future lessons as well, if there's nothing to be said right now. For the moment, I will go and stop our recording, and then we'll have our announcements and conclude our service.